Hey guys, what's going on? I'm Aish, and in this video I'm just going to be talking about learning to drive. This is part 2 of my learning to drive series, so if you haven't seen part 1 you might want to check that out. When I filmed the last video I'd had 7 lessons, which is 14 hours of teaching, and I was about halfway through the 2 months I was aiming to learn in. Naturally things didn't go as planned, and you might have seen from my other videos that I failed my first test, but I'm sitting here now able to say that I have a driving licence and my own car. In my second month I began to learn the manoeuvres that you need to learn for a driving test in the UK. There are a lot less manoeuvres than there used to be. Some people say there's 4. I kind of think of it as 3. So there is pulling up on the right and reversing 2 car lengths. There is bay parking, both driving in and reversing out, and reversing in and driving out. And then there's parallel parking on the left. You have to learn all of these, but they'll only ask you to do 1 on your test. The first one I learned was reversing 2 car lengths, and at first I was like, oh, this is easy, I hope I get this. But after I learned the others and I started having to practice reversing 2 car lengths on roads with a curve, I realised that it wasn't as easy as it seemed. Bay parking was easier, but it was also like learning 4 manoeuvres, because every time we'd practice driving in and reversing out, and then reversing in and driving out on the left and the right. It was like 4 manoeuvres, but just 1 or 2 if you count them as 2. On your test they'll tell you whether you're driving in and reversing out or reversing in and driving out, but you get to pick the bay. I found the left was a lot easier for me, both when I was driving in and reversing in, but I wanted to practice all of them because there might not be bays on the left, or the bays on the left might be busier, or they might have like a lamppost that makes it harder or whatever. But yeah, so I was practicing all of them. I just had a preference for the left. I think it's important to practice all of them because you don't know if there'll be bays on your preferred side when it comes down to it. Parallel parking was tricky at first, but it soon became my favourite type of parking, and this was solidified more when my instructor got her car back, because I'd been using a courtesy car since like 5th lesson and I hated it. The whole car swap thing did delay my learning at times, but it was also good to see how different cars drive, and it did help me know what I like and what I don't like when it came to choosing a car down the line. We also did a lot more work on roundabouts in the second month, and this eventually led to me driving test routes and then doing mock tests. I found roundabouts really scary at first and I still hate them, but I think my competence and even my confidence has improved a lot. I kind of forgot about show me tell me questions until not long before I was due to take a test, and when I first remembered I like panicked a lot and I was really stressed, but then I realised that if you get them wrong, even if you get them both wrong, it's just a minor and there are much more important things to focus on. By the time I had a test booked, I'd only passed 1 mock test, and that's still the only mock test I've passed to this day. I didn't think it was in the bag, as it were, but I did think I had a chance of passing. I knew the routes and I knew the mistakes I'd failed on in my mocks, and I recapped these things and like key roundabouts the day before, drew little diagrams so that I knew wherever I approached each roundabout from, whichever exit I was taking, I knew where I needed to be. I even went outside and double checked that I could read a number plate from 20 meters, because even though I'm a glasses wearer and so I get my eyes checked regularly, I just had this panic that that would be what I'd fail on, so I thought it was better to check and I could read, and yeah, that eased that panic. By the end of the evening before my test, the thing I was most worried about was what examiner I'd get, because I'd made the mistake of reading the reviews of my DVSA test centre, and yeah, I do not recommend that. It was not helpful, and there's nothing you can do if you get an examiner that other people have said is really harsh. And also, the people that leave reviews generally tend to be people that are either really happy or really unhappy. Most people, when they pass their test, are probably too busy driving to actually leave a review. So yeah, I feel like most of the people who leave reviews are people who failed. So my first test was just before Easter, and I'd had 3 lessons the week before, and I had a lesson the day before, and I had an hour lesson before my test started, although that's more of a warm-up than a lesson. I was quite nervous, especially after reading all of those reviews, but the guy I got seemed okay. He seemed fairly helpful. I can't remember what his name is, but I didn't feel like he was unfair. If anything, he seemed like quite a good guy to get. There were 3 of us learners, and they sent us all on the same test route. So once we got in the car, he was like, oh, we're going to start the independent driving and put the sat-nav on. Annoyingly, the sat-nav was blocking the reference that I use for pulling up, so every time I pulled up, which you have to do a lot in your driving test, I was a bit worried that I wasn't pulling in enough. Generally, I think my examiner was quite helpful. Like, he clarified instructions when I'd misunderstood the sat-nav, and he even gave me lane pointers when the independent driving part was done. I feel like, and I felt like, and even my instructor said, that I drove pretty well throughout most of my test. My parallel parking was like the best I'd ever done. I was really scared that I'd hit the curb and I wouldn't swing in nicely, and I'd hit the curb in my parallel parking practice right before my test, but no, it was like fucking amazing. So how did I fail? About 5 minutes before the end of my test, there was an ambulance blue lighting, and I got a bit flustered because if I stopped where I was, there was an island, so it wouldn't be able to pass me on our side of the road. It was a bit behind me anyway, so I carried on going a little bit and then started to pull up, and I was a bit unsure about where I was pulling up, but the examiner reassured me, and I was a bit flustered still and worried that his reassurance or the need for it or whatever, or my hesitance would cost me my test. But you know, I think I only got a minor for it, if anything. I got 1 minor in this test, and I'm not completely sure when I got it, but I think this seems like the most likely point because it was for pulling up. Once I pulled off again, the examiner told me to turn right onto a dual carriageway, and I've been practicing this right turn in the middle lane, so I chose the middle lane to do this right turn. Did the right turn, that was fine, but then he tells me we're going to take the next right, and so I know that I need to not just move to the right lane but then move to the sort of filter lane to turn right. And basically it was quite busy, and I checked my mirrors, but I missed something in my blind spot, and they beeped at me, and my examiner put his hand on the wheel to guide me, and yeah, I knew then that I had failed, and my heart just sank. I was so fucking gutted, especially when I realized that I could have just gone straight and not taken the direction if I didn't think it was safe. But I think the problem was that I did think it was safe because I was missing something. So I don't think I'd ever have thought to go straight. It wasn't that it was unsafe and I did it anyway. I thought it was safe, I was just mistaken. It was brutal to drive back those last 5 minutes knowing I've then failed. I tried to tell myself to keep driving well, but I knew that there was no way that I could pass after that. I was so annoyed at myself for failing with 5 minutes to go. When I got my results, I was surprised to learn that I actually failed like 30 seconds into my test. At the start, he had told me to go out of the road I was in, turn right, and then start following the sat nav for the independent driving. The nerves meant that I completely forgot what he said once I had set off, and I clarified with him as I was heading towards the top of the road. And as I was doing this, some pedestrians started to cross, but there was a van parked, so I didn't see that they'd started to cross. So by the time I got to where they were, I was just in the way. And because I was in the way, I then moved forward. This is where, unbeknownst to me, I failed my first test because you must give way to pedestrians at junctions. Absolutely valid, but it felt a bit harsh because I had no way to see them. Maybe if I hadn't moved when I did, everything would have been okay, but yeah, I did. But I would have still been in their path rather than giving way. So I don't know. The lane changing debacle was quite rightly marked as a dangerous fault. I was both gutted and relieved to know that it wasn't just that I failed on though, because I think it would have felt shit if I really just had failed in the last 5 minutes. But I think it also feels shit knowing I did such a beautiful parallel park and it counted for nothing, and it was never gonna count. I got the 1 minor for pulling up, which yeah, I now realise was probably the ambulance, but I didn't know what it was for at the time, and I was just like, maybe it was when I pulled up for the end of the test because I was so demotivated. But yeah, I was surprised and even chuffed that I only got 1 minor. Even if I got 2 major faults, it still felt somewhat of an accomplishment. Failing my driving test was absolutely gutting. I had plans for if I'd passed, and they were now like dead in the water. I felt so stupid and frustrated with myself, and to make matters worse, my dad made a dig about it, which just poured salt and lemon juice and sulfuric acid and everything else in the wound. I've said it before and I'll say it again. The worst thing about failing my driving test was not knowing when I'd get another chance to try again. It's so hard to get a driving test in the UK right now, and I also didn't have any driving lessons booked for the rest of the week, so it felt so crushing to think, oh, I could have been driving, and now not only have I not got my license, but I'm also not going to be driving because we had hoped I'd pass. As a bit of a consolation prize, I got insured as a learner on my mum's car. I hadn't wanted to risk it when I was a baby learner, but even though I'd failed, I was a lot more competent than I was, and it at least meant that I could do some driving. The problem is, learning with family is not like learning with an instructor. They don't know what you've learned or how you've learned, and they've usually learned a long time ago, and things might have changed since then. They also might have picked up some bad habits on the way, and there's also no dual control, and I think that adds a lot of tension. In my experience, they also nitpick things that don't really matter, and this was a great recipe for overthinking everything. All of this, along with the fact that my mum's car is a lot bigger, made learning in it with my dad's supervision a really anxious and stressful experience. And by the end of the week, I'd given up because it was making me lose the little confidence that I still had. Confidence was the key thing that I was lacking, like more more than experience and skill, I think, in a lot of areas, and I'd worked so hard to build it up and I didn't want to lose it. We had just been looping residential back streets, which, if you ask me, is a lot harder than driving on main roads, especially in a big car, because it's harder to navigate around all the parked cars, and it just made me feel like I was going backwards. Any driver with enough experience can supervise a learner, but I think it takes a particularly patient one to supervise a learner effectively. It also probably helps if the car you're learning in isn't a precious belonging of your late mother, but I think the size and even value of the car and the lack of dual controls is what made my dad such an anxious supervisor. But I think the fact that he didn't know what I'd learn or how I'd learn, or at times underestimated what I knew, also added an extra layer of frustration. Which is not his fault, it's just the nature of the dynamic. It would be the same if I got a new instructor. They wouldn't know what I'd learn or how I'd learn, and they might be teaching me things that I already know, and it would be stressful. For those reasons, I highly recommend not learning solely with a family member, and even straight up avoiding it if you can, depending on your relationship. I realise not everyone can, and I realise not everyone even gets the opportunity to learn with family, and I'm really grateful that I did, even though I did not enjoy it. I'm very lucky to even have someone in my family able to teach me, because not everyone has that. But I am also extremely grateful that I have the opportunity to take professional driving lessons, and I realise not everyone can do solely driving lessons. But I think even if you are learning mainly with family, it helps to get a professional opinion to give you comments that someone who has taught you would not kind of think of, oh yeah, you could do it like that, or to see where you're going wrong, and sometimes just seeing different ways. So yeah, personally I recommend the professional route, but your experience may not be mine. Some good did come out of it though, because I was finally able to drive my mum's car, and that experience made me realise that it is not a practical car for me. As much as I like the sentimentality of driving my mum's car because, you know, she's not around and it's not being driven, and like I've always liked her car, I have to be realistic. It's not a practical car for me. For one, the size makes it hard to handle, especially for a new driver, especially in London. Looking at my left wing mirror, like on the passenger side, if you are not in a right-hand drive country, felt like looking miles away. The size also meant the car was a lot heavier, so the drive of the car when neither pedal was applied was a lot slower than I was used to, which made slowing down for turns quite finicky, because I was used to just like not needing to accelerate, but I'd need to accelerate but also be ready to brake behind parked cars in case something was coming, and it was just difficult. Secondly, I think the pedals were not a good fit for me. So one was like flat on the floor and one was like a floating pedal, and I think for some people this would probably work, but for me it felt so hard to get from the accelerator to the brake, which made me feel less safe. I think for my dad, when he drives it, his foot can reach both from the same position, but for me I have to move my whole foot, and it just felt like it would take me a lot longer to get to the brake when I need to. And when combined with the first problem, like the drive of the car being slower than what I was used to and needing to accelerate where I wouldn't in other cars, it basically seemed like a recipe for disaster, because I couldn't always be ready to brake when I would normally want to be ready to brake. And as a new driver, I think I want to be able to brake pretty quickly. There's a thing with learners of like being a bit tunnel visioned and just looking just in front of them, so there will probably be a time where I'm not looking far enough up the road, or you know, something happens suddenly where I might need to react really quickly, and I think my reaction will be slower anyway because I'm a new driver and I'm maybe less experienced at just getting to the brake fast. But also this would just make those situations where I might suddenly need to brake a lot harder and a lot riskier than they already are. I think as a new driver that is probably even more important, but I think it's important regardless of whether I'm a new driver or not. I had looked at other cars in February when there had been some doubt over whether my mum's car was going to be a good fit for me, but after this I started to take that more seriously. I have driven my mum's car since, but driving it is not like driving my car. In an ideal world, I would have been able to get a car and been able to practice in it before even passing my test, which is something I've seen others do, but I couldn't test drive a car as a learner, and after experiencing different cars, I felt like test driving was really important, and I wasn't willing to commit to a car without knowing whether I liked driving it. After failing, I cut down to 1 lesson a week at first. It seemed sensible in theory, as I didn't have anything more that I needed to learn, I just needed to practice, but in reality, it made getting into the car every week feel alien, and I'd spend like half my lesson just getting used to driving again. I worried that if I got a cancellation test, I wouldn't be ready, especially if I hadn't had a lesson in the last few days. Like if I got a test on a Monday and I hadn't had a lesson since the Tuesday before it, that's a long time to go without driving, and you've only got that 1 hour before your test to get used to it again, let alone go over anything. So I went back up to 2 lessons a week, and since I'd learned everything that was on the test, we started learning other things. So I learned a 3-point turn, which isn't on the test, and we did bay parking between 2 cars, and that really increased my confidence, because even though I could do bay parking for the test, I was worried that I'd never be able to park in real world scenarios where car parks are rarely empty. So I found that really helpful. We also did a lot more test routes and mock tests, and we did this a lot because it took me a long time to find another test. At first I tried using cancellation apps, and a lot of people say they have success with this, but I didn't have any. I don't know if it's being in London or the specific test centre that I needed a test at, but I was just having no luck. After not getting anything, I ended up paying a deposit for a cancellation test. They are expensive, but to me it made more sense to pay for a cancellation test than it did to keep paying for 2 lessons a week until I found a test myself. I found it really hard to plan anything in my life at this time because I had no idea when I'd get a test, and you usually don't get a lot of notice. So I mostly didn't plan anything too far in advance, and I planned things knowing that I might have to cancel. It was a little tricky to find one that both me and my instructor could do, but when I did, everything fell into place. It was a day and a time that we both could do, which was asking a lot because my instructor's availability was really limited that week. It wasn't too early, and it was also not on a day that I had any plans, so there was nothing to cancel. Since it was Wednesday, my instructor offered to book my usual 2 lessons on the Monday and Tuesday, so I actually got 4 hours of proper lessons plus the hour warm up before my test in between booking my test and having it. There were some hiccups in those lessons, and I managed to fuck up a parallel park in a way that I'd never done before, but once we figured out why, I felt a bit more reassured and ready. On the day of my test, I was really nervous, like in some ways more nervous than I had been for the first test. The pressure was on because I was going away at the end of June, and I wanted to pass it before then because I felt like if I didn't, I'd come back and I'd be rusty and I'd need even more lessons. When I met my examiner, he told me his name, and I immediately knew he was one of the better ones that my instructor had told me about. I was still dreading getting one that had been written off as harsh in the reviews. But no, he was friendly and almost funny, to be honest, and it put me at ease a bit, but I was still nervous. After reading the number plate, he asked me my tell me question, which was how do I check if my indicators are working. I had to reverse a bit to get out of the space we were in without shaving, but you know, soon we set off in the same direction as where I failed my first test. But that was my choice. I decided that I wanted to go out that way because I didn't want to go out a different way, so I had parked in that direction. At least this time I was aware and I let pedestrians cross. The first turn out of the road still had me nervous, but I still tried to drive well, and as well as I had the first time. My instructor said that a lot of people fail within the first 10 minutes, so I was just trying to get past the first 10 minutes. We did the usual pulling up and pulling off a few times, and then at some point he says we're going to start the independent driving. And he says something like we're going to take 3 lefts and then I want you to follow the signs for the A12/Romford or whatever. So I set off, and after I'd done a left or 2, he was like, oh, actually, let me try something, and tells me to turn left. And I turn left and it's into a car park, a pretty packed car park that I've never been in before. He tells me to choose bay and drive into it. And as I said, like my bay parking is a lot better on the left, so I wanted to drive in on the left. Problem was, the way he was sitting, he was covering the reference that I use in my instructor's car for bay parking, which is just like some stripes on the army bit of opening the door. I was really unsure whether to just park on the right or whether to say something, but I remember being told by my instructor that I should have just asked the examiner from my original test to move the sat-nav so I had my reference for pulling up and pulling off. So I did just ask him, you know, like, can you move? And he said something like, what are you gonna do when you have your own car? And I was like really worried that this would be a point of failure. So anyway, I pulled into the bay and I wasn't quite sure if I was in enough, and there was some kind of bushy thing in front of me. And I know the Kia Picanto has quite a short bonnet, but I was also scared of going too forward, one into the bushy thing, but also like scraping the bonnet on the pavement, curby bit, whatever. But you know, I got into the bay, I was in my bay, and then he's like, okay, then reverse out. So I start reversing out of my bay, and like I've done my observations, blah blah blah, and then I see movement, and so I stopped. And then I realized it was only someone getting into their car like fairly far away from me, wasn't going to affect me reversing out. So I said that because I wanted him to know why I'd stopped and was now continuing. Like I didn't want him to think I'd stopped for no reason or I was incompetent or anything like that. So I just said something like, oh, it's just a woman getting in her car, and he made a joke about it, and then we exited the car park. At the top of the road the car park was on was a stop sign, and I've only gone to this stop sign or this like little side road once before, and it was like in the days before my test. My instructor had warned me that there will be a lot of people crossing. So as I was approaching, I stopped because there was someone crossing from the right, and and then I, was about to start moving, and then someone approached from the left. So I stopped again to let her cross because I wasn't about to fail for not letting a pedestrian cross at a junction again. But she just looked at me and she stared at me for so long, needing some confirmation that I had stopped for her. And like, I wasn't going to give it to her. At least I didn't think I was. So she was just stopped and staring at me, and I didn't want to go because I knew that I needed to give way to pedestrians at junctions, even if they're stopped on the curb, and I didn't want to fail on that again. And two, I didn't want to end up doing that stop-start dance where like I go a bit but she's finally got the message, so she goes a bit and then sees I've gone, so she stops and I stop, and we don't know who's going, and it's just confusing. I knew I couldn't beckon her, so I just sat tight, and I sat there and she stared at me, and I sat there and she stared at me, and then without even knowing it, my head just goes, like, I didn't know I was doing it. I just did it. I've never done it before. I know not to do it. But I think the pressure of her just staring at me and us being sat there, both not moving for so long, like, it felt like an eternity. As soon as I'd done it, I knew I shouldn't have. I don't even know why I did it. It just felt like instinct. I didn't even realise I was doing it until I'd done it, and by then I was kicking myself. And this is where, in many cases, I probably would have failed again. But yeah, she crossed and then I turned left and stopped at a zebra crossing on Wanstead High Street, and then we got on the A12 and I successfully changed lanes for my approach to Redbridge roundabout because I needed to carry on going on the A12, and the lane I was in was going to go on the A406. If you know the area, you know what I'm talking about. But yeah, third exit on Redbridge roundabout towards Romford. Usually my instructor tells me to turn right at some point after that, and my examiner didn't. This meant I came out at Gants Hill roundabout and he told me to take the first exit towards Woodford. I think it's the A14 something, maybe zeros, or maybe there's another 4, I don't know. And as I did this first exit, I got quite close to the high curb, but I realised and I moved away. I did actually get a minor for that, but I think being aware of what I'd done made it not such a huge blow when he told me at the end. On the next roundabout, we continued towards South Woodford, and I told him I was turning my indicator off once I'd exited because there was a turning, and yeah, he was just like, okay. And I think this is where my instructor could tell I was nervous because I was like just explaining things. Eventually we ended up at Charlie Brown's roundabout, and he just told me to take the first exit towards Snaresbrook, and this is something I've done many times, so that was fine. I did worry that he might think I was going at a point when I was just like edging forward to see, but I don't think he did. I was so thankful that we'd done the manoeuvre on the way because that meant that we were on our way back to the test centre, and that gave me a little bit of relief. I got another minor on the way back for turning into Nelson Road when I was coming down Herman Hill. I think it's Herman Hill. Is it Herman Hill? I don't know. But yeah, I just approached too fast. I was super proactive when I was coming down Wellington Road to like pull up for the end of my test because I could see a car coming, and even though I could see a gap, I wasn't sure I could fit in it, so I just told him like, I'm just waiting here because I'm not sure whether there's a gap, even though I could see a gap, and I just wasn't sure. I wasn't sure if me not being able to judge whether the gap is big enough would count against me, so I told him I wasn't sure if there was a gap. But yeah, car came out, I went down, we pulled up in the same place that I pulled off from. At this point I had no idea whether I'd passed because I knew I'd been really close to that high curb. I knew I shouldn't have nodded, but I was also not sure if he'd seen it because it had been so subtle. Waiting for him to finish his notes and stuff was just like agony, and then he stopped and he showed me his screen and it said pass. I got 3 minors. The high curb closeness at Gants Hill roundabout marked as control steering. The speed when turning into Nelson Road marked as junction approach speed, and response to signs and signals road markings. I don't think he even remembered where I got that one at the time, and I definitely don't remember it now, but I got that one. He then said he wanted to talk to me about something that he hadn't marked me down for, and he mentioned me nodding at that woman, and I actually felt relieved that we got to talk about it. I told him that I'd never done it before and I knew it was wrong and that she was just staring at me and it was like a reflex, and I also told him that I failed my first test because I didn't let a pedestrian cross at a junction, and he just told me that I've gone too far the other way. I think I was so lucky not to be failed for this. Like, if anything, me and my instructor have discussed this, and it was more dangerous than the crossing thing in my first test that I did get failed on. But like, I think I was really lucky to not get failed for this. But I feel like it's really important to talk about because like, it's not something I've ever done before. It's not something that I don't know is wrong. It was just reflexive and instinctive, and like, we are humans and we communicate, and so when someone is staring at you like confused, I think it's really natural to like respond to that even without thinking about it. I was really hesitant to include this in this video, and a couple of people even advised me not to, but I do think it's important to mention. I know that it might make some people think that I didn't deserve to pass, but I did, and no one can take that away from me. I think it's important to be honest and also just point out how reflexive that kind of reaction is, because like in those moments while that woman was staring at me looking for a sign of my intentions, it just felt very instinctive. And at the end of the day, we are all humans, and a big part of being human is communication, and I think it's really easy to slip up. Established drivers have assured me that this is kind of an instinctive response, and I think that if you end up in a stop-start dance with a pedestrian, it probably feels even more instinctive. But I hope by highlighting my error that other people will make a more conscious effort not to do it. Don't think you can get away with this, because most examiners will fail you, and I am incredibly lucky to not be in that position. I can only imagine that my examiner had some empathy for how long and intensely she was staring at me, and honestly I don't know how long we would have been staring at each other if I hadn't nodded, and maybe he even saw my reaction once I realised what I'd done. This whole situation has made me a lot more aware of my need to suppress those instinctive kinds of responses, even if they're not something I normally do, because I understand why you shouldn't beckon pedestrians, and I completely agree with it. As I've said, I was really lucky not to fail on that. I think it is probably unusual for someone to not fail on that. Like, there is some subjectivity in driving examiners, and I was just lucky. In the same way, there's probably examiners that would not have failed me for, you know, what happened in my first test, not the lane change thing, but the pedestrians crossing thing. But these examiners do this day in and day out, so we just have to trust their judgment. And even if we don't, it still wins. And I'm certainly not going to dispute it here. If anything, I feel better knowing he saw my nod and passed me, rather than thinking he passed me because he didn't see. And trust me, I've beaten myself up about it enough to have learned my lesson.
It's good that she allowed plenty of space for the pedestrians that wanted to cross the road, but she actively waves the next lot of pedestrians across the road, encouraging them to cross the road, and that's not something you should do. I can't remember a time when my pupil has waved a pedestrian across the road on test and it not be a serious mark. Doing so is not a serious mark in itself, but it often leads to dodgy situations. During one driving test I can remember, a moped overtook us on the left just as my pupil waved the pedestrian into the road, and my pupil failed the driving test. The moped overtook us because we had stopped, so the act of stopping encouraged a vehicle to pass us, whilst my pupil was encouraging the pedestrian to cross the road into the path of the moped. We used to teach people not to do this due to the hazard it creates, but the new H2 rule in the highway code encourages drivers to put pedestrians under pressure to cross the road when the pedestrian is already waiting for the vehicle. This often makes the pedestrian rush, and when they rush, they are more likely to get hit by a vehicle.
After passing, I went to test drive my car of choice, a Volkswagen Polo. I liked the car, but the test drive itself wasn't the smoothest experience. I test drove a Yaris and a Polo again the next day, and that kind of confirmed things for me. I was originally thinking of getting the driver's assistance pack, but I also wanted heated seats, and I'd been advised that basically if I wanted those two things, finding them together in the colour I wanted was going to be pretty impossible, and it would be a factory order. So if I wanted the driving assistance pack, I'd have to sacrifice heated seats, or I'd have to wait for a custom order. So I decided to settle for a Polo match with front sensors and heated seats, which seemed to be a really popular combination. The driving assistance pack included front sensors, but the main thing that I had wanted originally that wasn't included in the spec I got was blind spot monitoring. It also had other features like self-park and whatever, but I only was really caring about it for the blind spots. But blind spot monitoring doesn't really take away the fact that you still need to check your blind spot, so I kind of felt like it wasn't worth compromising heated seats or how fast I could get a car for. When I looked, there was a Polo with the spec I wanted in Romford, which is really close to me, and this is where I found out that buying a car is not like buying an iPad. If you see they have it in stock, you cannot just go and get it that day, and I had to wait like a week, and it was a very long week. In the meantime, I was driving my mum's car, which was difficult, but also a really big confidence boost. I think part of the confidence boost was passing, but also I was just handling the car a lot better because I had more experience. So I passed my test on the Wednesday, I did my first motorway trip on the Thursday, I did my first big motorway trip from London to my hometown in my mum's car with my dad supervising on the Sunday, picked up my car the next Thursday, and I was doing my first motorway trip from my hometown to London without my dad by the Sunday. My older brother used to drive me back to London, and on that Sunday I drove my younger brother back to London, and it felt like everything had come full circle. I'm really proud of myself for passing, but I'm also really proud of myself for learning, to be honest, because there were points where I really thought I was going to give up. I'm pretty book smart, so having to work hard to pass the test was kind of new to me, especially in a domain that is so different to the ones I usually succeed in. But yeah, having to work hard for a pass was pretty new to me, as was failing, to be honest. I would say it's a good experience, but it really fucking wasn't. I'm also really proud of myself for just getting into it, like driving on the motorway, driving alone, driving at night. Like, it was scary at first, but I also think it's only going to be not scary by doing it. I'm still fine-tuning parking in my new car because it's different to my instructors, and I'm still getting used to things generally, but I know these things will just take time. I literally today just finished doing Pass Plus, so I need to send off my certificate for that, but that has helped a lot with experience and things, and also made me feel more confident, and my instructor said I seem more confident. I know Pass Plus doesn't really help with insurance prices anymore, but I do feel like it helps with competence. At least that's been my experience. It was a bit weird driving my instructor's car after not driving it for a while, but I've also just come back from Italy, so it was a bit weird driving even my car after not driving it for a while. But since like a week or so before my test, driving has started to feel more and more natural. I still get flustered at times and I still make mistakes, but the key thing is to try and drive safely, and hopefully those mistakes won't be too hazardous. I will make an update on this video in a few months, probably when I have had some experience as a new driver, as a new car owner, and blah blah blah. So if you have any questions that you want me to answer in that video, let me know. And if you have any questions that you want me to answer about this video, you can let me know those too. But yeah, that is finally the end of this video. So thanks for watching, guys. Don't forget to like and subscribe. If you're a driver, drop a comment down below and let me know how many takes it took you to pass your test and where that was. If you're a learner, let me know if this was in any way useful, interesting, or relatable. And if you're neither, then do you want a lift?